Well, good morning and welcome to this special LinkedIn Live Flash panel brought to you by Optiv, the Cyber Advisory Solutions leader. We're grateful that you've chosen to join us this morning. I'm Justin Williams, Managing Partner at Optiv. I'm joined by my good friends and Optiv colleagues, James Turgill, Vice President, Cyber Risk Strategy and Board Relations, and Adam Wazinski, Director, Strategy and Risk Management. Last March, James, Ab, and I gave our first Optiv webinar on, at that time, a proposed SEC cybersecurity disclosure rule. At that time, we talked about three core tenets of the rule as they were proposed. That would have been the cyber incident management, cyber program governance and risk management, and board of directors. Those three elements were core tenets at the time. Some things have changed since then. We've been helping organizations become SEC ready over the prior 16 months. And on July 26th, just a few short hours ago, the SEC finalized adoption of its cybersecurity disclosure rule, requiring public companies to fast track their efforts to start complying with a list of SEC requirements related to cyber attacks. Some companies, we may be scrambling to make sure that we're all in compliance on day one. Others, we may not know where to start. So Jim, Adam, and I are here this morning to walk you through and help to the extent possible. Today, we're going to talk about what this means for organizations, boards of directors, and the industry as a whole. There's a lot to digest, and it is still developing as the rule was just released over the last 48 hours. Let's start and just dive right on in. Adam, how about we talk about the timeline, given that we expected this to be finalized or adopted later this year, but yet a couple of days ago, we in the industry all received the news that it was adopted and a timeline was set forth.
Yeah.
So why don't you walk us through that?
Yeah, Justin, no, you're exactly right. I think everyone initially, right, we were thinking with the proposal that was out there and the timelines that the SEC had set themselves. Initially, I think most of us were thinking that April regulatory agenda. Obviously, that date came and went. Then the conventional thinking and the conventional wisdom was going to be the adoption of the rules in October. So here we are, surprise, 2 days ago at this point, the rules were adopted and are now going final. So when you think about kind of the language that's being used, right? So again, from an SEC perspective, these are now adopted. These now have to be put in what is called the Federal Register. That timing is still a little bit fluid, but really that's kind of a key impetus to the overall compliance dates. So I'll say kind of the last compliance date. So there's the two components, right? We have the incident management or the 8K and the 6K elements. The last date of readiness and compliance will be December 18th. Now, I say that's the last date of compliance because ultimately, if this gets into the Federal Register ahead of maybe schedule, you have that's the actual reading is 90 days from when this is published into the Federal Register. So you can kind of work backwards from there. And then the other piece right around the annual disclosures and your 10K report. So the outline for that is if your annual report or if your fiscal year ends on or after December 15th, 2023. So anybody that's basically like a 1231 filer or after, you are now going to be required for your next annual report to follow the disclosures that are set out here in the rule. Now, there is one slight provision for those that are the smaller companies that are out there. The SEC is giving a little bit of leeway for the smaller reporting companies, 180 days, 270 days. Their language that they used is because they feel like there could be a little bit of further development for those particular filers to be able to create some of the disclosure processes and procedures. So again, a little bit of extra lead time for those smaller companies, but again, pretty aggressive rollout and adoption timelines coming up.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And through this topic or through this discussion today, we'll dive into what that means for all of us, right? Because when we look at items 105 and item 106, there are some substantive efforts that we believe must be undertaken in order to be ready to hit the filer requirements, right? So year end and closures relative to any aspect of what is defined as a material cyber incident. So speaking of materiality, Jim, let's talk for a moment about the board. In the last 48 hours, there's been a lot of press going around and it's mixed, right? And on one hand, we can all get excited that action was in fact taken. And while from the security community, we may not have elevated the requirements for a board member to have and have the necessary qualifications from a cyber standpoint to sit on the board to represent cyber, it does appear as though the SEC is turning up the heat on CISOs and CEOs because we still have materiality aspects that we have to get right up and as we lead up to the filings requirements, and then we'll dive into item 105, which still requires us to define our risk management process, and it puts the CEO and the CISO square and center in educating the board. So maybe you can opine for a minute on the impact of the board, probably two specific areas, right? One, materiality, and then the provision for national security matters.
Yeah, so this is, we talked long and hard the last time we've had this, and I've spent, I spend all my days here at Optiv in front of boards and in front of C-suites talking about this very issue. One of the things that I find amusing about the final rule set here is that the SEC is now, they were very specific about carving out both of the board piece, right? And here's the CISO piece, and there's no safe harbor for national security. And now they've kind of mashed the CISO board governance part of what management's role here together. And I find that interesting, right? There has to be a conversation, and obviously boards, from the board position, look, boards deal with systemic risk in an organization, no matter what it is, right? Whether it's financial, whether it's disruption in the industry, whether it's a hurricane, a natural disaster, whether it's cyber. So I get the fact that there is cyber is a part of any kind of risk that a company, publicly traded company, actually deals with. I disagree with the fact that they've now pushed necessarily naming the chief information security officer and providing for a broader, what I would consider management view of this, right? Their 106C2, right, talks about whether and which management positions or committees are actually responsible for assessing risks and assessing cyber risks and relevant risks. The processes that these persons or committees actually talk about, or what do they go through, right? How are they informed? How do they monitor the prevention, detection, mitigation, remediation, right, of cyber risk? And then, only then, how is that reported to either a subcommittee, or how is that reported to the board? And so I don't like the fact that they've kind of mashed this all together. Certainly boards are still going to have to provide there's going to have to be some statement within the reporting about this. And then the whole concept of materiality in and of itself has just dramatically changed, right? I talked last year when we did this about what is the whole concept of materiality has to be from the reasonable investor standpoint. And I'm like, okay, what is that? Who's the reasonable investor out there? And so the final rule really requires companies to describe the material aspects of the nature, scope, and timing of the incident, the material impact or reasonably likely material impact on the victim, and including its financial condition and results of operations. Okay, that's really, really vague. So companies we're really going to have to work with them to understand that. And yes, once materiality is determined, you have 4 days from the moment that you determine materiality to then report it.
Thanks, James. And so we're all on the same page, right? So item 105, Form 8K. Item 105 is the new requirement. And Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, but that is in fact the year-end requirement that will go into place that says we have 4 days to report or disclose a incident of material or materiality, right? It's determined on behalf of the organization,
Yeah,
correct?
that is correct. So the 4-day reporting time frame. Now, again, I think you hit the critical word there. Once it has been determined to be material, right? So that has not changed. That is still that is definitely, and that's the December 18th at the latest, from the dates we covered earlier.
Excellent, excellent. Now, as we talk about materiality as it relates to the nature, scope, timing of the incident, that is 105, the disclosures, item 105, the disclosure side of the house. So for us, and what that means to all of us is that we have to ensure that we have a process and policy and procedure all nailed down, right, ready to clearly understand and educate all constituents within security, our leadership, and the board apparatus around what rises to material impact, right? Or reasonably likely material impact of the incident on the registrant as the law states or the rule states. And so that is a very significant undertaking that we suspect, and Jim, being a recovering attorney, can qualify the statement, but your general counsels and GCs will be heavily involved in this, because as we take this back down into our operating layers, when we have an event, right, we are dealing with events day in and day out, thousands, hundreds of thousands, however many events. And so we're going to have very specific language in order to identify when events rise through levels of criticality, ultimately reaching a threshold of materiality. And that is going to take some time, notwithstanding the fact that this rule was just adopted on 2 days ago. Our runway to get very succinct and tight internally as an organization has just become quite short. Now, I know that many of you all who are listening, we say we've got a fantastic and very mature incident management process and incident response capability, and we know precisely when certain things rise to a level of materiality. But remember, this materiality now requires for you to publicly disclose to all shareholders a possible impact to your financial condition or impact to operations. And so we believe you're going to spend some significant time working through what materiality means from an event standpoint before we start disclosing publicly certain incidents. Let me just pause on that.
Let me jump in there, because this is I don't think the SEC has done anyone any favors in trying to provide specificity on this issue, right? So the whole concept of what is material from the reasonable investor standpoint, right? They tried to go a little bit further about requiring material aspects of the nature, the scope, the timing of the incident. Okay, we can reasonably understand what that means. But when you start talking about the financial condition, what are the results of operation are not necessarily, exclusive of, what are those qualitative factors out there alongside the quantitative factors, right? Is it the amount of data that they took? Is it the impact on your brand? Is it a third party? Is it a vendor relationship? The material impact on the company. And let's face it, anybody who has worked these, and from my FBI experience, I worked hundreds of these, right? Not everything, except for the ransomware case where you walk in one morning and you turn on your computer and up pops the banner, right? With the exception of those, guess what? These attacks come in piecemeal, right? They don't come in, all at once. You're going to get little parts of systems that go down, right? And your understanding, or your ability to understand materiality is really important, but it literally takes the entire company, right? Those are IT decisions, those are legal decisions, right? You're going to need your CFO because there's financial decisions that go along with that, including any regulatory piece that's going along with that as well. So you really need to define that. What are those qualitative factors that affect your company, your industry? And then what are those quantitative factors as well that affect your company, your industry?
So Jim, to get this right, in effectively the next, call it, quarter and a half time, this is going to be a tight turnaround for many organizations. Fair?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just defining those alone, from both the IT viewpoint, I view this three different ways, right? There has to be these three types of sub-organizations within every company that's publicly traded that has to do this. The IT folks have to understand and be able to define what are those qualitative and quantitative impacts on those systems, right? We talk about crown jewels, but guess what, right? Not every cyber attack affects the crown jewels of a particular company, right? The general counsel's office is going to have to opine as to, what are those qualitative and quantitative factors. So does the CFO. So that's those three pillars, those main three pillars inside an organization that's going to have to be able to define that, so that, God forbid, on December 20th, right, or December 31st, something happens, you're going to have to absolutely have that down, not just the checklists of what it takes to get there, but then who's going to make that call and how are you going to brief it to the board.
And Jim, just to kind of follow up on that, so we've been working with a couple of clients that got out ahead of this, right?
Yep.
And working through this early. And I think you hit on something very, very important, that as we partnered up with them, that again, we experienced that it's not, I would say, a little bit less typical when we think of kind of cybersecurity. And that was, again, the involvement of the C-suite. So it was the CFO, the COO, the CIO, the accounting teams, the internal audit teams. I mean, everybody coming together. And again, as Justin highlighted, with kind of a short runway to get this all going, that's a lot of people and parts that need to come together very, very quickly.
So wrapping a bow around, if you will, what's referred to as item 1.05, the disclosures aspect. This is an opportunity, and Adam, as we've supported organizations, to your last point, this is an opportunity for us in the security community to continue evangelizing and wrapping, and not necessarily wrapping, but pulling together all key constituents across our organization from the C-suite. First, educating, and two, now we have to gain alignment precisely on what materiality means to our business, because all officers will be involved in the disclosure as that goes back to the SEC. So it's an opportunity for us to come together. And I believe you've been seeing that, right, through your work.
It is, but then at the same time, right, even though if you look through some of the other changes, there's still that importance of whether we're talking material risk or not from a cyber perspective. There is that expectation that cyber risk in your program and your risk assessments and all of those processes are in place, and that information does still make it up to the board level. So I think that's one thing that may have gotten a little bit lost in a little bit of the changes, is that fundamental component is absolutely still there.
Let's dive into that real quick. Item 106, right? I'm going to read the rule requirement, specifically stating registrants must describe their processes, if any, for assessing, identifying, and managing material risk from cybersecurity threats, as well as whether any risk from cybersecurity threats, including as a result of any previous cyber incidents, have materially affected or reasonably likely to materially affect the registrant. That, Adam, to me is the precise point for which you just made, which is, while we may not have gained a seat on the board, this rule and that item 106 requires for the C-suite and the board to get involved and to clearly work from what is an event as it works its way up through what is determined or considered to become material. Right. And so that, to me, 106 is offsets a little bit of the negative sentiment that we lost a seat. The SEC still understands that the importance of the role of the CISO. I think, in my opinion, and we're starting to see some of that sentiment come out in the marketplace, that they're really turning the heat up on the CISO because of 106, and they're turning the heat up specifically on the CEO as well, right? Because those two roles that have the fundamental responsibility to disclose when a material event or a material impact is occurring.
Yeah.
Pause for comment on that, either Jim or Adam.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And look, remember these are yes, these are the rules that are now out there. But I said this, and I've worked a ton of cases in the FBI where the SEC was involved. So look, there are enforcement actions that will these may be the published rules, right? We need to have a conversation, 12, 18 months from now to talk about what are those cases that have come out of this, right? What are those enforcement actions that have now come out of these rules, this rule set? Because that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's the actual enforcement piece and how this is going to be interpreted, which is going to have a real significant impact on these companies. And then whether, to Adam's point before, the whole safe harbor piece for some of the small businesses, right? And then you lump into this, right? The law enforcement piece that I forgot to talk about earlier, where there was, in their original proposal, there was no safe harbor for law enforcement or national security issues. Was vehemently against that, and they have actually placed that in there. So now there is an actual 30-day, what could be a 30-day delay by the Attorney General of the United States to go ahead and say, look, here's a national security issue or a law enforcement issue. And so we are able to actually look at the company, look at the victim and say, look, you're not going to disclose this for at least 30 days. And then there's an additional 30-day. So it could go 60 days normally, or in extraordinary circumstances, right? It can go even longer to, I believe, about 120 days. So there are some safe harbor aspects that are built into the final rule. But that is, again, that whole concept of everybody needs to be at the table here, and everybody's determination of materiality and impact, right, needs to be part of that discussion.
Couldn't agree more, Jim. And because you hit on it, back on the law enforcement side and the safe harbor side, again, putting a point on it for all of our audience members who may just be coming up to speed on this requirement. This really gets back to the fact that, Jim, you've been working cyber cases before they were referred to as cyber, right?
Yep.
And what that has allowed for the SEC to observe over a long period of time is that, the cybersecurity threats and incidents, they're escalating at a more rapid pace that pose significant threats to our shareholders, to our investors, to the market participants, to the market as a whole. And really, this is the SEC's first attempt to pull all of that together in support of all the work that your team and your organization provided for 2 decades plus now.
Right. Yeah, and it's really trying to understand, what are it's trying to define what I call quantifiable harm. How every company, every registrant is going to have that discussion internally. Like Adam said, within the next 90 days, how do you define quantifiable harm to your organization, right? What is that materiality determination? And right, is it, again, crown jewels? Is it part of, what are the steps that you use to get there? But you really need to understand and define for yourself what is quantifiable harm.
Adam, let's move into our audience team members. We try to keep these in the 20 to 30 minutes range, so we won't keep you all too much longer. We do think it's important to hit on supply chain, and supply chain from probably 2 different aspects. First and foremost, we have a supply chain requirement as it relates to the vendors for which we all leverage. Think third-party risk management. The other aspect here is that from a supply chain standpoint, part of the disclosures, there is significant interest in now requirements centered around the need to report our organization's reliance on third parties from a service provider standpoint. So again, as we think through materiality, the investors and the market and the SEC wants to know how much risk is derived as a result of having an internal team versus a outsourced team, et cetera. So we think supply chain is one of the next core elements. And so Adam, maybe you can just walk us through your perspectives on supply chain risk management.
Yep, no, and appreciate that. And as somebody that went through the majority of the comments that were submitted, or at least the publicly available comments that were submitted to the SEC when this was still in the proposed phase. So the pieces around supply chain and third-party risk were probably the second most commented piece outside of the materiality element. And really, as you look through the core proposed rule sets, actually were adopted, right? And a lot of the language, if you go through the 186 pages or whatever that were issued yesterday, or excuse me, on Wednesday, a lot of it was, hey, we heard the comments, but really, just because you don't have control of somebody in your supply chain, but they're a service provider, or you don't have the right level of controls around it, that does not exclude you from being able or having to report if there's an incident that affects you, right? So that is just one of the things. I mean, there's so many conversations on a day-to-day basis that we're having, and this just happens to be the SEC's adding this in from a supply chain perspective as well. So you're right. There has to be again the processes around how you're evaluating those, how you're making sure from a risk perspective that you're not introducing risk into the environment. But then again, tying into the incident management disclosure perspective, there's kind of the twofold elements here, right? So if there's something that comes from a third party that impacts you materially, there would be an expectation that the registrant would file. If your supplier happens to be, or that third party happens to be a registrant themselves, there could be that double filing. So they may have to put one out there, and you as well. So it's not getting rid of that requirement if you're taking reliance on that supplier. So again, it's just one of those things that we're continuing to see a lot of emphasis and a lot of traction out there. And again, I won't say it's an over focus. It's something that, again, third parties, fourth parties, the nth parties that are down the line, that just happens to be a pretty significant threat vector that exists today. And it's just something that, again, as we think about from a risk management and ultimate governance perspective, why I think we all think that is why it remained within the rule.
Yeah, and let me just throw in here again as the recovering attorney. Look, this is the regulatory aspect of the third party relationship that the SEC is talking about. You're going to see a flood of lawsuits between actual registrants and third parties who, if they're not registrants themselves, even if they are, guess what? If they don't believe that the impact on their system, or if they were the victim, and then the actual registrant's data is lost, there's a whole conversation and a whole bunch of litigation you're going to see between the first party and the third party out there about what they define as materiality. Because I guarantee you, right, depending upon where you sit, that definition is going to be different. There's a whole wide chasm between the discussion on whether it's impact to company A versus impact or material impact to company B, whether they're registered or not.
And Justin, to that second part of your question around kind of then the disclosure, if you an outside or external parties to support cybersecurity initiatives. So again, that was another element that was put in there. Now again, the final or the adopted rules backed off a little bit. So there is still an expectation that a company would disclose if they are using an external party to support certain processes and procedures. It's again, from that reasonable investor perspective, it's to give some comfort. Now, it won't go into the details here, but to me, the way that it's phrased within the actual rule, it's a little bit hard to measure. So I think, again, we're going to have a little bit of back and forth over the first, I'll say, year to 18 months as these disclosures have to be put in place to make sure that language and the amount or the level of detail that is disclosed aligns with the expectations.
Yeah, totally agree.
Awesome. Let me walk us through today. We've got some questions that I think hit on some of these key points, and I think from an audience standpoint, I hope that we can leave you with some clear perspectives, some clear outcomes for you to action within your organizations. But we spoke timeline. We spoke about what it means for the board and the overall sentiment on the situation with respect to a board seat, not a board seat. Letting the board off the hook per se, but turning the heat up on the CISOs and CEOs. We talked about materiality, and we spoke about supply chain. Now, I walked us through those core tenets that we walked through today, because consistent questions that are coming through the LinkedIn channel, but also consistent questions for Adam, Jim, myself, when we're engaged with our client base, centers around what we talked about kind of right up front, right? Which is, item 105, 1.05. This is the disclosures aspect, right? And so when we walk through and you peel that back, or you either process flow map that or value stream map that back into your organization, the consistent questions on the top, it says, hey, listen, so we have to report within 4 days of identification or discovery, but rightfully noted, generally speaking, we all are still working through our traditional IR processes within a 4-day window, right? We still may be in triage, right? We may, we don't know where we're at in that actual investigation. And so a consistent question comes up to that point that says, if we're working this IR incident, how do we exactly go about reporting within this 4-day window? And that gets back, gentlemen, back to that value stream mapping, that business process that says, we have an event, we have many events that occur within our enterprise on an ongoing basis. They rise almost, Jim, back to our federal worlds where, we have our classification standards, and it rises through, and then it's maintained at the highest level for which it was stamped at. As we run our incidents up through our triage process, and it becomes an incident from an event or an incident, however you classify it, we're going to this is the time for which we opened up this discussion on. It's going to take significant work to get to your policies and your procedures and the process down, so that by year end, we all precisely know at what time do we say that we have discovered a material event or a material incident. And that, Jim, I think is the inordinate amount of work that has to go through from a legal standpoint, because we're going to do a lot of work long before we get to meeting the hurdle rate of material incident. Is that a fair assumption there?
Yeah, and let's be really plain and honest to the folks that are out there listening. Well, if you're the SEC is going to come in and define what is reasonable, what the reasonable time period. Remember, if it takes you normally, a week or 10 days to work a particular type of DDoS attack or ransomware attack, or some type of password spray attack, or whatever it is, if it takes you 30 days to figure that out normally, when you've had those type of attacks before, that's okay, right? Your 4-day clock doesn't start until you determine materiality. The problem here is if you have a really crack IT team, and normally they take 10 days to work at this type of DDoS attack, and you get hit with another one, and now it's taking you 30 days to work that, or a longer period of time, right? That's when the SEC is going to start to come in and look at you and go, okay, there's a problem here, right? It's defined based upon the normal ability of you to actually work these, right? And again, you're going to see a number of enforcement actions come out of this, which will help define, at least from the enforcement standpoint, what the SEC's expectations are.
Yeah, that's going to be a very significant one, Jim, for us all. Yeah. That's going to take some significant time. Adam, you had pointed out, the initial disclosures that come out in Q1 of 24. Somebody will go first, and we will all learn from that. But that for the organization that has the liberty of going first, an inordinate amount of time will need to be spent to ensure, to the extent possible, that the level of materiality has been reached and the disclosure is appropriate based upon impacts to your shareholders and the investment community. Adam, supply chain question that has arisen. Maybe you can take that.
Yeah, so there's a question out here that says, will there be more content required in contracts or vendors to disclose their processes to comply with the SEC cybersecurity rule? So I think you can answer that in a couple of ways, right? So if that that third party happens to be a registrant, I think by default they're going to have a lot more that they're going to have to do on their side. And so whether we're talking SOC 2 or some of those other type control sets, right, there's going to be a lot more coverage. Now, if you look at the original SEC's proposed rule set, there was a lot of discussion around making sure there was some processes and procedures in place that you would document as a registrant about how you look at the contracts in place. Now that has been backed off a little bit in the adopted rule set that we're now working on going forward. But again, I think the language there is that there's not going to be a requirement that registrants conduct additional inquiries outside of your normal process. So again, right, you're hearing us talk a lot about processes, less so about like the formal policies and procedures. Now those processes build upon those, right? But it's really going to be, if we talk about supply chain or third parties, right, that entire end-to-end way of doing an initial triage, an assessment, understanding what are they a critical, high, medium, low, going through that end-to-end, looking at the contracts. If you have that process built in from end to end, that's to me our interpretation of what they're looking for here when it comes to that. And then ultimately your contract piece would be significant when it comes to SLAs and things that you may be measuring from a metrics perspective on those third parties.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. Well, gentlemen, any final thoughts related to the topic that we'll wrap up here in the next couple of minutes?
You know, I would just, everybody listening, right? You're a publicly traded company, right? Go back to those three kind of pillars I talked about. Every part of your IT cyber team needs to start the process of understanding how are we going to report, what is material, how are we going to define materiality, what are those things inside of our IT and cyber teams that we can actually do to provide information to the C-suite. The C-suite has got to have their understanding, including the CFO, the CTO, and the CEO, about who's making that call. What are the financial implications of this, and how do those financial implications agree with and or add to materiality? And the general counsel, which is the third piece, you know, the legality of this and understanding that all those three parts have got to, in the next 90, 120 days, have really got to sit down and define that.
Excellent. Thanks, Jim. Adam, any final comments?
No, my final comments are we've covered a lot of material here today. Again, there's a lot of stuff if you're going to go read the regulations directly, about a good 180 pages or so. But I mean, the takeaway for me, right, it sounds weird, but now that we have some clarity, right, we know what targets we have to go to. We know it's a tight time frame. But again, as we've worked through ahead of this over the last 16 months and worked with some of our clients, I think it is a little bit of a sense of relief, if you will, that we know what we have to go hit. And now it's just a matter of, again, you've heard about all of the people that are going to be involved here, starting to rally that and getting it started. I mean, as soon as you can, right? I mean, the time is of the essence. So starting those internal discussions, starting just some of that awareness is going to make you all as successful as you can.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, thank you both for sharing your expertise on this timely subject. And thank you to all of our audience for joining us on this LinkedIn Live session on this Friday morning. For additional insights on this matter and or any other cyber related topics, please visit us at optiv.com. Thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend.